Today I'm talking with Bill Laswell, and we're going to be focusing on the early part of his career and the beginnings of material and what led up to that. Hi, Bill. How you doing?
Okay.
Before we get into talking about the early material stuff and your early time in New York City, I know that you have a new project out with John Zorn. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it's a duet record. We did a lot of duo live uh, concerts, but we've never done a record, just the two of us. So he called me not too long ago to do that, and that's the result of that conversation. We did it, and I think it just came out. So
Yeah, when did you record it?
it's been a few months ago, but I don't remember exactly the time, but a few months. And he put stuff out pretty quick, so must be like it's less than 6 months ago. So,
Right. And is it all improvised?
well, except for our natural repertoire, which we've been developing for a long time, but yeah, it's improvised. But
Yeah.
again, it's really based on the language that we've developed over the years. So,
Right. Well, maybe you could go into a little bit of detail about how you developed that, because you met Zorn pretty early on when you arrived in New York City back. Well, when did you meet Zorn?
uh, it's around the same time you're talking about, and
78, 79?
yeah, and I believe we probably met at Gomelsky's.
Aha.
I think it says something about that in his liner notes.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Well, now that you mentioned Gomelsky, this is uh, a topic that I am very interested in. I'm working on a book about Gomelsky called The Gomelsky Recordings. And I know you spent quite a bit of time with him in '78. But
yeah.
before you got to New York, you were a young person in Detroit, right?
Well, I came to New York from Lansing, Michigan,
Okay.
and I think around '76, I believe. Like and I met Gavilski pretty early. So
Uh-huh. Um, but but before you go to New York, you're a young person exploring the music scene in and around the Detroit area. Can you tell me a little about what that was like for you?
wasn't really exploring anything around Detroit. I was living in Lansing, Michigan,
Okay.
and I played in Detroit. I went there a lot. Ann Arbor, Lansing, East Lansing. And I got you get gigs at the colleges
Uh-huh.
in those places mostly, and Detroit. If you're coming from Michigan and you go to New York, you tell everybody you're from Detroit.
I
So
see.
yeah, really, that's how it is. And I'm not from Detroit, and I don't know that much about Detroit. More about Ann Arbor, and there was a big music scene in Ann Arbor. Things that I would be more interested in than whatever was happening in Detroit.
So how old were you when you started playing with bands in Ann Arbor?
Well, I started playing in a small town in Michigan called Albion, and I started playing when I was about 14, and just built it up from there, trying different things, and mostly related to um, I don't know what you would call it. It's not really R&B. It's rock related. It's R&B related. and from those times, kind of funk bands related, and and I was discovering a lot of things during that time.
Do you remember any of the particular people you were discovering then?
Well, so many, I was aware of all the music that's around you, that's live music, and I would, you find Anthony Braxton or Derek Bailey or these kind of people that are very different from what's around you, and that was kind of fascinating. So I started to follow that. Don Cherry or Nick Coleman. It became my interest, and from people like Don Cherry or Ginger Baker, they were traveling and recording and playing in places in the Middle East and Africa. With Ginger, especially in West Africa. So that became a kind of big obsession. Like, how do I do that? Get to Africa, get to India. And that was, I wouldn't say it's a goal, but it was certainly that's my interest. And I, over time, managed to do it.
So did you see Ginger Baker play in the Ann Arbor area in those days?
I saw Cream when I was 14.
Aha.
Yeah, and I was reading about Ginger, where he was, going to mostly, I think, especially to Nigeria, and they they made a film, Ginger Baker in Africa, where it shows him driving through the Sahara and down to Lagos and the different parts of West Africa, playing with. What I liked about Ginger was he wasn't a tourist. He would go and just play with the local musicians. So
Yeah, and also in in the Detroit area around that time, the couple of the better known acts were like Iggy Pop and MC5. Did you get a chance to see any of those bands?
I saw Iggy many times, and MC5, yeah, both many times. So,
What'd you think at that time?
well, it's. I thought it was very powerful, and Stooges. They're not musicians. They're not playing. They're not players. It was a concept, and it was mostly to do with energy. And MC5 and Iggy Pop, they were all connected to that scene, which was a guy called John Sinclair.
Right.
He created this kind of concept of creating festivals. Like, you might go to a street concert and it'd be like Archie Shepp opens, and then Funkadelic plays, and then the MC5, and that's what made me, really, was that combination of putting all these things together at one time. And I'd like to think I'm still doing that. So.
Right. So at some point, you start thinking about relocating to New York City. Do you remember what prompted you to make the move?
Well, we had a band, and we had a van, and we had a lot of equipment. Those days, coming out of, like, in the stores in Detroit or Ann Arbor, you could just get equipment if you have a little money, and I had a ton of equipment, and it was myself and Dennis Whedon, who's Menace. went on to play on a lot of records, and we came together and we had a roadie. I believe his name was Akbar, and the three of us came with Akbar driving, and we we had to go. We had done everything we could there. You know, there's no one else to meet. There's no other place you can play, and it's time to get serious and go. If you like somebody, go to New York. You know, people say, "Why did you come to New York?" And I always said, I wanted to meet Miles Davis. I wanted to meet Ornette Coleman, and I wanted to play with Tommy Bolin. And when I got to New York, a friend of mine, or a guy that I knew, was playing with Tommy Bolin, and he was getting ready to leave to do his own music, Fernando Sanders, and so I met Ornette right away, and I met Miles kind of right away. And Tommy Bolin died of an overdose, and that was that. And so I just continued on, and I discovered the East Village and the CBGB and the punk rock scene and the loft. There was a loft scene of free jazz. So if you put that together, the punk scene, which was starting to kind of alternatives to it. There were different music coming out of that, and then from the loft scene, and there was improvisation. That's where I started to meet people like John Zorn, and that was part of what, again, just continuing from Michigan, that kind of gave me a kind of direction and kind of enlarged my what I had done, what I was interested in. It kept building, and everything seems that it was moving very quickly, and you're meeting people very quickly, and things are kind of coming together, and that's where Gomelski came in.
Right. But before Gomelski, so you say you meet Ornette Coleman and Miles Davis like soon after you arrive in New York. So when you meet them, how does that happen, and what's the conversation like?
Well, in the case of Ornette, I met a guy who was standing in front of my building in 8th Street in downtown, and he was trying to sell a movie script of a William Burroughs film to Brian Eno. And then when I came outside, it was this guy his name was Hassan, and he was standing with Brian Eno. And I was kind of hustling Eno every day to get work. And Eno went home, and I talking to this guy, and I said, I'm trying to find Ornette Coleman. And he said, well, I know where he lives. I'll give you his address. And he didn't have a phone number. So I went, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I just went to the house and rang the bell, I think on, 15th Street in Midtown, and a woman answered the door who looked like maybe African, and then I went in, and Ornette was kind of sitting on the couch playing guitar and watching TV, and he was rare because you could just go to his house anytime and he would just let you in and talk to you. And I went there, and on that Sunday, and had a long conversation with him about all kinds of things. And then I started coming every Sunday afternoon. I would go to Ornette's house and bring him CDs, or not CDs then, but cassettes of music, and invite him to gigs, which he would come to. So I knew him. In case of Miles Davis, I had a friend who was from Chile, who I just saw like a few weeks ago, who's still around. And he called me one morning. I lived in, where was it? Gowanus, Martin Beasley's place.
Yeah.
And I got a call, and it's this guy, Felipe, and he said, you need to come right now to this place. And it was about 8 o'clock in the morning. And I said, what's happening? He said, trust me, just come here. You need to come here. And so I got it together. I had like no money, nothing. And I got on the subway and went to this address, and I opened the door, and it was a party that had been going on since the nighttime, still going. And I look around, it's mostly Colombians and the guys from the Chilean people, and it's a lot of drugs and a lot of girls. And I came in, and when I got into the main room, on the couch was a guy wearing a silver leather jacket, and his hair was all messed up, and he was drinking beer but putting like pills and barbiturates in. They had ran out of drugs, I think, and they were down to beer and barbiturates. So that was Miles. And I went in and I started talking to him, and I said, I have a band, with Sonny Chirac, and he remembered Sonny. He didn't really remember a lot of the names of people. And I thought he had a kind of guy with him, like a bodyguard. And I talked to him for a long time. And then when they get ready to leave, I said, well, I'll walk with, I wanted to see where he lived. And I said, I'll walk with you guys to where you're going. And it was not far on the west side. And when I remember when I got back, I called people that I knew, like Oludara. He was a trumpet player. I mean, he is a trumpet player, and I called him and I said, I just met Miles, and I don't think he's going to live that much longer. He's pretty out of it. But he came back like within a year, and I couldn't believe it. But we came back, and he didn't do great music, but he came back.
Yeah. Yeah. And you got to meet him. That's a pretty good
No,
story.
I met him many times after, but that's how I met him.
Right. Right. And wow, so these are some key players: Ornette, Miles, and Eno standing out in front of where you're living. That's
Well, yeah, he lived just down the street, and I think it was '78. I did a lot of studio recording with him, and there's a couple of records that came out from that period. So.
right. Yeah, he was in '77, '78. He was in New York working with Talking Heads, I believe.
Yeah, he hadn't even heard Talking Heads. I went with him to a Talking Heads concert. CBGB's made like a temporary theater, and they played there, and I went with him, and he became kind of fascinated with them. So.
Yeah. So Eno is in New York, and then Gomelski comes to New York. Do you remember meeting Gomelski?
Yeah, I do. I met Gomelski before Eno, and when you used to play in these clubs, mostly punk clubs, people would just come up and say, "I want to hire you for a session," and then half the time they wouldn't pay you anything. But you wanted to get the experience, so people would they would come up to me, and then I would go. They'd give you a ride, and then they'd bring you back where they found you. Usually CBGBs, and that's before I met Eno. And one of those sessions, some people came and they said, "We have a session tomorrow. Can you come to this studio?" And we're doing a session, and nobody talked about payment or anything, because they figure everybody's like trying to get known or trying to get ahead or something. And I went, and it's a studio that was called Blue Rock. I remember that. And we went into the main room. And what's funny is a few years later, I played in that same studio, same room with Eno doing stuff. And this time there were guys that they played with, some guys from Lou Reed's band and from a band called Rhinoceros. And I didn't really know them, but I heard of the bands they were in. So we played, and it was pretty basic rock stuff. And I realized that after every take, everybody would go in the control room and listen to the take. And I never went in the control room. I always stayed just wait for everybody to come back. And that's what I used to do that a lot because I did sessions in Detroit like that, at like Invictus Studios and places like that. And I never went to the playback. Same for that day. And I just sat there. And when we were all done, we were leaving. But the whole time I looked through the glass, there was a guy wearing a Magma T-shirt, and it had the Magma logo, and I recognized that because I knew that band. And when we were leaving, I opened the door and I said, "You know Magma?" He said, "I'm Gomelski. I produced Magma." And I said, "Oh, okay." And he said, and he was surprised that I knew who Magma was. And then he said, "Well, what are you doing later?" And I said, I'm good, whatever. And he said, "Well, come to my house, and then I have a friend, and we're going to go see Captain Beefheart." So I went to his house on 16th Street. He had got the house from Kit Lambert, who I think had something to do with The Who. Maybe he was a manager or a producer, I don't know. Anyway, I went to 16th Street, Brownstone, walk up. And I'd never been in an New York apartment like that. And I went in, and there's Gomelski and his friend. His friend happened to be Jack Bruce. And so we all said, "Let's go see Beefheart." And we went it was at the Bottom Line, which was a club downtown. We went there and talked a lot with Gomelski, and then I kind of stayed with him for a while because he had stories and he had a history and he had a good memory at the time, and he liked to drink a lot. And that was the short beginning of the Gomelski time.
So when he first introduced himself as Giorgio Gomelski, did the name ring a bell to you?
No, it did not. And but I immediately went back to some records, and I saw this is the guy. He did a lot of things, and a lot of progressive things. It wasn't just, okay, I know the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and all that. What was impressive to me was that circuit that he was involved in, where you have Soft Machine, Magma, Gong, Henry Cow, all that stuff. He was very much involved in that.
And so you hit it off with him, it sounds like, and
very much so, yeah.
Yeah, and
but I have a kind of history of, I worked with the with the big guy, you know. So Gomelski was there, then later on John Caracos, then Alan Douglas, and then
Yeah,
Chris
that's
Blackwell.
the celluloid guy, that's right.
Yeah, but I met Caracos through Gomelski.
I see.
Yeah.
And so you end up hanging out at Gomelski's place quite a bit sometime after that.
Well, not long after that, Gomelski moved um, from the 16th Street, and he got this building, which was 3 stories and big space in the bottom of it. And I started helping him clean up the place and bringing people there to help. And 24th Street, and that's where I met a lot of people. And he brought musicians, and the people would be staying there, and that's, you know, I met Fred Frith through that connection. So.
Right. And yeah, this 3-story place ends up being a regular rehearsal spot for many people that you will meet, I assume.
Yeah, I lived there. You know, I lived on the Gomelski lived on the 3rd floor. I lived on the 2nd floor. And in the big room downstairs in the back, they created a rehearsal space. Actually, in the basement was the rehearsal space. And that main floor, he would do concerts, like gigs there. So.
Right. Okay, so you're living at Gomelski's place and you're meeting a lot of people. And Gomelski has some plans. And one of them is for this big 12-hour long festival that will be called the Zoo Mana Festival. Do you remember when you guys started talking about that?
Yeah, a little bit. You know, it's some of it's clear and some is not so clear. But I remember he really wanted to do this big event, and he wanted it. I think he really wanted it to be a thing where he could travel and create this everywhere. But he pulled it off in New York, Zoo Mana Festival, and I don't have much memory of it. It's so many people involved, and all from kind of diverse backgrounds, and I don't know, just
Yeah, well,
different.
the main attraction apparently was David Allen,
I
and
guess, yeah,
and Gomelski was putting together a New York band for him that you became part of.
right.
Um, and as and in an effort to get a band together, you and Gomelski um, composed a flyer and put it around record stores and other places in New York. Do you remember the flyer advertising for musicians?
Yeah, yeah, I do remember the flyer, and I made it, and not Gomelski, and we put a lot of names on it that were, I don't think anybody knew who the names were, but the ones that did freaked out, and they thought, wow, this is like what we want to do, this kind of stuff. So from the flyer, people responded. I think they responded directly to Giorgio's house, and then a few people started coming in and to respond to that, because it seemed to them something new, and it was very unusual, you know, to see that. I remember the flyer very well.
Do you remember the bands you were naming on the flyer?
Oh, it was those prog bands like Magma and Henry Cow, and but uh, the more obscure ones and electronic bands, and but it was all kind of prog related, but some of it really obscure. So
Yeah. Well, the flyer attracted the attention of two very young musicians. One was Michael Beinhorn, and the other one was Fred Marr.
Right.
And they come over to meet you guys and talk about it. Do you remember meeting them? I mean, Fred Marr was only like 14 or 15 at the time.
Yeah, Fred was really young. I remember that, and well, they were both pretty young, and then yeah, I remember the not too many people responded to that flyer, but they were the ones that I thought were interesting because first of all, they're really young, and that's going to always be interesting. And they had a kind of sense of taste that I thought was was unusual. So
And another key player that would end up in material was Cliff Coltrane. Did he respond at that time, or when did you meet Cliff?
well, Cliff worked in a record store, and that's one of the. I used to go there like every day almost, and he had a knowledge of records pretty good, and he knew bands that if I didn't know it, he knew about it, and he would tell me, "What if you know this? Check this out." And he had a good sense of records, and I don't know what happened to him, but he was always really good with the music that you don't hear about so much here. Like journalists in New York, they didn't know who these bands were. What is that scene? Like Chris Gow and everybody, they really didn't know.
So
But
you,
Cliff knew somehow. So
yeah, and you met Cliff at the record store?
at the record store where he worked, and I gave him these flyers to put up, and he wanted to be involved, and so he came. Beinhorn, Fred Marr, Cliff Coltrane. That's the kind of the key people that we tried to create some stuff. And again, they're not really players. They're not like heavy musicians. Um, but they had a good sense of taste, and they knew what they liked, and they liked interesting things. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that record store was called Pantasia. Do you remember that
that's
name?
right. Yeah.
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 Do you know the guy who owned that is still doing a version of a record store? Of course, it's online now, but it's amazing how some people are, really hang in there with this stuff. Did you know the owner of Pantasia?
No, I did not. I just knew Cliff, and I would go there quite a bit.
And then another key player at this time is Mark Kramer, who would go on to be the founder of Shimmy Disc Records.
Right. Yeah.
Do you remember meeting Kramer?
Not so much. Kramer was around, and he played on some of the gong stuff, but I didn't have much connection with him.
I see. It seems that Kramer was involved with a place up in Woodstock called the Creative Music Studio. And
Yeah, that's Carl Berger.
right, and Ornette Coleman was a founder of that as well.
Well, no, Ornette and Carl were the creators of that, and then Ornette realized he didn't want to drive to Woodstock all the time. It's
I
too
see.
far,
Yeah,
and Carl took it over. And to this day, Carl has, I think he still has that property, which is all built on an Indian burial ground. So it's a little voodoo there. So,
right. So going back to '78 here, you put out this flyer. Were you already familiar with the Creative Music Studio and what was going on there?
I think at that moment I was not, but probably soon after I would be. So, and
Right.
then I met Carl through Ornette, and we went to that. They had a recording studio, and that's one of the early recordings I did. It was with a band called Curlew,
Oh yeah, George
and I
Cartwright.
think, yeah, I think we recorded that in the Creative Music studio.
Yes, I believe so. I talked to George just about a month ago, and
Oh wow,
yeah, we talked.
where is he?
He's in Wisconsin,
Okay,
I think. Is that
yeah, I
correct?
like
Yeah.
George. He was a good guy.
Yeah, we had a really nice chat, and he's still doing a lot of music, and he's involved with an avant-garde scene where he is. Um,
Okay,
um, they put out some video recently that was really amazing, I thought. Um, anyway, that's you'll meet George later in our story here. Right now, we're getting ready to do the Zoo Mana Festival, and there's a lot of activity taking place. And Giorgio's trying to invite people that he worked with in Europe to come over for this festival. And
right.
David Allen is like the main guy, and Giorgio had been working with David in France for quite a while. Did you know David Allen, or at what point do you meet David Allen?
Well, I met him at Giorgio brought him, and when I met him there in the house, and I knew about Gong and Gong kind of went in a few directions because there's David Allen, which is kind of hippies, and then there was another Gong, which was I forgot the guy's name, was a drummer,
Oh, Pierre
but they were
Moreland?
yeah exactly, and those guys did more like a fusion thing, but I knew who before David Allen came. I knew about Gong. I knew who he was, and these are hardcore hippies. So.
Right. And so he comes to Giorgio invites him, he comes over, you meet him, and you guys probably start playing together right away, right?
Yeah, and by that time I had met these kids who were going to be, I guess, the band. And Fred Marr, we broke off in another direction where we met when we met Fred Frith, and we created Massacre,
Right.
and that was I thought very effective, and I don't remember. I know with Fred we were going to go to, that was with David Allen. We went to France, and I remember going to Fred's house, and I met he was like 16 or something, and I met his father, and I had a bunch of records like Coltrane and things, and I wanted his father to know that we're not like a punk band, we're not a drug band. It's we're trying to be serious, and Fred, he shouldn't worry. And I convinced him, and Fred came to France. I think he was like 16. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been 6 months. The France tour is about 6 months or more after the Zoo Festival.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And you did the North American tour too, which I want to get to in a minute.
Yeah.
And then Massacre is like a year or two after that, I believe, right?
Sounds about right. But
At least
Massacres,
according to the recordings. I mean, you were probably playing together for longer before you released the recordings.
yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. And, Massacre would play mostly in punk clubs. There was nowhere else to play. And, I think it had an influence on people. So,
So before the big Zoo Mana Festival in New York, when you're really early stages of putting this band together, um, You being the the bass player, the drummer is obviously super important. And
Yeah,
what is it that you saw in Fred's drumming that early on that you knew he was the guy?
I probably didn't know for sure that he was the guy, but there was again, I'd played with real drummers, and he had this crazy energy, and it wasn't like a punk rock thing. I think it had to do more with his age. He was just discovering things, and you know, uh,
Yeah,
anyway, I turned down a few drummers that were great drummers, but and then over Fred, because I thought Fred had this energy and then, when we got to Massacre, Fred Frith really, I think he really thought that was vital, to help push what he was doing, and he wanted that energy, and I really got it more than even before. So
right. So Fred Frith also gets involved in the Zoo Festival. Um,
right, that's how I met him.
yeah, um, and there was a poster put out for the festival that listed most of the people who were going to be performing. But I noticed that Fred Frith's name is not on the poster. Do you know why that was the case?
No, I don't, and I didn't really remember. I remember that poster, what it looks like, but I don't remember how they listed all the names. And maybe Fred came later. I don't know.
Yeah, I was wondering if I know Gomelski basically flew Fred over uh,
Yeah, he did.
for this, and I was wondering if maybe there was some difficulty getting Fred to the States. Did he have like a visa problem or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know that part, but he made it, and that's where I met him, and we started doing stuff right away. So
Okay. Um, I also heard that around this time, before the festival, at one of the rehearsal sessions at Gomelski's place, the players included John Zorn and Eugene Chadbourne. Um, so it seems like you had hooked up with these guys before the festival, but Zorn and Chadbourne were not part of the festival. Do you know why that was the case? Seemed like they would have been a natural addition.
I don't know, and they were completely unknown at that time, so I don't know if it was essential to have them involved, but I don't remember them being involved at all in the festival. But again, that's around I remember Chadbourne, meeting him, and I remember Zorn. And with Zorn, we were like really far apart in terms of what we were doing or gonna do or had come from, and took a while for me to reconnect with him. People were always saying we're the exact opposites.
Oh,
Yeah, which they still do, I guess. So
so do you remember much about the day of the festival? I mean, this festival was over 12 hours long.
yeah, I don't, to be honest, remember the day of intermediate theater, I guess it was,
Yes.
and I always get it mixed up with the Nova convention, which was the Burroughs um, kind of event that he had there, and because it's the same stage, same everything, and it's around the same time. It came a little later, but I always get those two mixed up. And the Zoo Manifestival, I really don't have much memory of it. Playing, not no memory at all.
Huh.
And who was playing? Hardly any memory.
Right.
So
Um, there are some pictures from the festival. and of course it shows you playing, and it looked like an incredible number of musicians. One thing that stands out when you see a picture of the instruments on the stage is the number of synthesizers, and these are pretty large analog synthesizers for the day.
Oh.
Um, and do you remember Paul Sears, the drummer from the Muffins?
Not so much. I remember the name. I remember the name of the Muffins, which is
Yeah. He was recruited somewhat last minute by Gomelski to do the live sound for the entire day. Um,
okay. I didn't know that. So.
yeah. Um, and it sounded like it was a pretty chaotic day, as you can imagine. Um, and not too long after that, I guess it'd be a couple of months, Gomelski wants to take this on the road. Do you remember discussions about that?
A little bit. It was. I don't. There wasn't a lot of road. We went to L.A. and
Yeah.
across the country.
Yeah. Do
And
you remember that school bus?
I do. You know that school bus still exists, and it's in Woodstock,
Really?
and I believe it's on Carl Berger's property.
Graffiti intact?
Everything is should be the same, but that's I haven't really checked on that for a few years. I think it's still in the same place. It's where the CMS place was.
Right. Well, I'll have to check into that.
Yeah,
Do you remember traveling around on that bus?
a little bit. Yeah.
What was it like?
Uh, well, it was chaotic, and we had our isolated bunk bed on the top in the back, and everybody else was very uncomfortable. I think. So,
Yeah, Beinhorn said you had to defend that space.
yeah, I think they tried to overthrow us once at least, but they did not succeed.
And so you're on this bus for like 2 months traveling around with these guys. Um, you mentioned the LA show, which was probably one of the larger shows. Um, do you remember any of the other shows, or do any of the shows stand out in your mind? It was a long time ago.
Not, it's hard to. It's a long time ago. I remember we played in CBGB's, and some people really hated it because it looks like a bunch of hippies playing in CBGB's, which is supposed to be this punk rock place. And there was one in Kansas where some guy, I think he passed out in the front row, and everybody thought he died. I kind of remember that, but not not so much. Ann Arbor, Michigan, I kind of remember because I knew people who came there. Not other than that. It's hard to remember. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. Yep. And you end up, of course, back in New York, and Gomelski wants to do some recording.
Yeah,
So we should say that at this point, the touring bands were David Allen's Gong, that you played in, and then
yeah.
the newish band, which was at that time called Zoo Band, which you also played in,
Mm.
and uh, and then there was Mother Gong, which was Julie Smythe's band.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't remember what that was. It's all hippie stuff to me. So.
right. But the Zoo Band is what Gomelski wants to take to the studio. Um, So, do you remember um, when that became an idea?
Not exactly. No, it's just a natural kind of what's coming next. You know, we did the live, and now he wants to record something, and all that makes sense. And I remember a little bit the process and the recording and the results. So,
Right. So he would take you up to Woodstock to a studio up there to do this recording. Do you
yeah,
and and the physical studio happens to belong to Levon Helm,
right. I remember that. Yeah.
the drummer from the band,
Right.
and the engineer who was doing the sessions at that time happened to be Eddie Offord, the who even
I remember that too.
yeah who at that time was famous as the engineer producer guy for Yes and Emerson Lake and Palmer and other.
Right. Yeah, I knew about Eddie, and the way that all happened was Giorgio got some studio time in London, and it was they gave him a deal, and he could start it late at night, like midnight or something, and it was a great deal to record a project he had, and that project was John McLaughlin's record called Extrapolation. And the engineer who had been working all day, he said, I don't think I can do it. You know, I'm tired. I've been working all day. But he gave it to the tape op, to the assistant. That assistant was Eddie. And that's to this day that introduced him to being an engineer. And that was Giorgio who made that happen. And that's why Eddie Offord was always helped Giorgio because he made him get started, so that's how it happened.
And so that's back in like 68 or so.
Something like that, yeah. Around, yeah, really back.
So Giorgio and Eddie Offord worked together back well before Eddie would work with the prog bands.
Oh, yeah, and I don't know what happened in between, but if Giorgio hadn't put Eddie on that record, Extrapolation is a unique sounding record, and that's Eddie. So,
Yeah. And so Eddie is in New York when you show up to do this recording. And well,
well, it
he's
was in
in
Woodstock.
Woodstock,
So
right? And I assume you knew him by reputation when you meet him, right?
I think so. I'm not. I can't remember, but I remember knowing um, his name from like Yes and those kind of bands, and but I remembered Extrapolation, which is a record I know about. So.
Right. So what was your impression of Eddie Offord when you not only meet him, but you work with him?
Didn't really think of it. In those days, the engineer was the guy who's in the other side of the glass. So you don't really think about that so much. You just sit down and try to figure out what you're going to play. And I remember Levon's house, and he had that house until like not a few years ago, where he used to do these kind of live TV things, and same place.
Uh-huh. So do you remember Eddie having any input into the what you guys were recording?
No, I don't actually.
How about Gomelski? He's listed as the producer of those recordings. What was his input like during the recording?
Gomelski wasn't technical. He wasn't like an engineer type. He wasn't really a musician. He reminded me of, later on, I met people like Alan Douglas. They were similar. They knew how to get the energy right, and the people should, if they're not playing well or not doing the right thing, they knew how to address that. But they weren't really those kind of producers like you have in later times or modern times.
Right. I talked with Don Davis a couple of months
Yeah.
ago, who played sax on one of the songs.
Yeah.
You remember Don?
I remember Don, and I hear his name still occasionally.
Yeah, he's still quite active. Um, and he lived in the Woodstock area, I think, at that time. Although
Probably still does.
he's not quite in Woodstock. I think he's in New Hampshire now. But
Okay.
anyway, um, Don remembers Gomelski uh, being pretty active while Don was recording his part. Apparently, Gomelski, while the tape is rolling, came up to him and was you know, jumping around or gesticulating wildly, trying to egg him on in his performance. Do you remember anything like that happening?
I don't know.
Yeah. One other question about Don. I've been bouncing this off of other people. Um, the pictures that you see of the tour and you guys in the bus and there's actually a little video of the LA show that Zoo Band or New York Gong was playing in LA. Every one of these pictures, you see Don Davis wearing all white. The rest of the band is wearing black or dark colors. So Don really stands out. And then
Yeah.
when you guys get in the studio, the uh, the the only song that Don plays on is called White Man. Uh, Everybody who's been involved with this swears that Don had nothing to do with the name of that song. Do you remember?
I don't know. I don't think he does have anything to do with the title, but
Right. I just think it's just a funny point to me that the guy all dressed in white is also the guy that plays on White Man.
right. Yeah. I never made that connection, and I don't think there is a connection. So,
No,
but
I guess not.
yeah,
I will,
I don't think so.
I will have to put that to rest.
Yeah.
Okay, so not too long after the recording session, I imagine happens pretty quickly. Do you remember how long you were in the studio?
I do not, and I would say quickly is the key.
Yeah.
Because I don't recall that we stayed in Woodstock, which means maybe it was done in one day or something.
And you did 4 songs.
I guess, yeah.
And these songs were worked out. Did you, when you were on the North American tour, were you playing these same songs?
I don't remember, but maybe they were developing or coming
Right.
together somehow.
Okay. Well, you knock out this recording, and then pretty soon after, I think less than a month, you guys are headed to France for a tour.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about not just, well, so you're touring, you've toured North America, and now you're going to be touring France. You're still a pretty young guy. Um, you've been from Michigan to New York. These tours, is this your first experience with this much travel and seeing all these new places?
Yeah, I guess so.
Um, so now you're headed to France. Um, what what do you remember about the French tour?
Um, I there wasn't much money, so I remember staying with usually in the house of the promoter, And in some cases, these people lived in like weird castles and stuff. I remember that part. They had like a bear walking around in the kitchen, and it was strange. And it wasn't like you on tour and you get a nice hotel. We were staying with the promoters and stuff.
But how did that compare to who you were staying with in on the North American part of the tour?
I'd prefer the French part. So.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and also, the new addition on this tour is George Cartwright.
Yeah, George was on the French thing, I think,
Yeah, he
if I
was.
remember.
He
Yeah.
was. And and you and George uh, strike up a rapport because you will soon after this tour you will form a band together. Can you tell me about your time with George?
Well, with George, we had a in common thing that we both really liked Ornette's music, and I remember Ornette he wanted to make a band. I forgot what he was calling it, but he asked me to try to find musicians, and I invited George because I knew he really liked Ornette. So we kind of went back to that time, and then on this, it was around the same time, I guess, as the French tour.
Yeah,
So we had that in common, that we liked Ornette's music.
yeah. And not too long after you get back from the French tour, Curlew is formed.
Right. Yeah. I think Curlew was recorded at that CMS studio. So.
Yeah, I believe so. And also a couple of tracks, at least on the first LP, were done live, recorded live at CBGB's.
Right.
And I think Martin Beasy was involved in um, maybe all of that recording.
Right.
Yeah. So around this time, then you tour France for about a month. You come back to New York. You've got this material that you've recorded, the band, and the band was called Zoo Band when you went into the studio, and now the recording is going to be released, and the band is going to be called Material. What happened?
Well, I think there was a kind of split with Gomelski, first of all. It wasn't really a split. It was more like we just drifted into other areas, and he seemed to be going in the same direction. So
Uh-huh.
I think we wanted to, at the time, to kind of evolve and get out of um, that scene or that memory of uh, the beginnings of it and move on to see what's coming. And
Right.
so we didn't want to. You can't be the zoo band if you're going to change. So.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, the whole zoo concept seemed to be something that Gomelski was trying to develop more than just the band,
I guess so. Yeah.
because the record does come out and the band is called Material, but the label that the first Material releases on is called Zoo Records. Do you remember that?
I don't. Yeah, I don't remember.
Because it got that album, along with a lot of Material's early recordings, would get re-released many times. But
Yeah.
but yeah, the first release was on Zoo Records, and it's tried to look this up, and it seems like it may be the only release on Zoo Records.
That's quite possible.
Um, so did you stay in touch with Gomelski much then after that?
A little bit after that, and over time, not at all.
Right.
And
So you were living at his place. At what point did you move out?
I didn't live there that long, but I did live there. And when I left, we were still active with him and working with him, and I started to do a lot of other things, and
Right.
some some of those things were related to Gomelski, related to those beginnings.
Such as?
Massacre, and I guess you could say later on Curlew, and the different things. They all kind of connected to Gomelski.
Right. What would you say was Gomelski's impact on your career then?
Well, he, like I said, had a great memory. So I used to listen to his recollections and his stories. And through Gomelski, I met a lot of people that some of them I still work with. And, it's all kind of related. Turned me on to a lot of things but most of it I knew about. I just didn't know the details.
Right. I asked Michael Beinhorn this, and he said Gomelski was the vibe master. That's how he referred to him. He got he got people together and made things happen. Um,
He's old school producer style. Put people together, hype everybody up, and try to find the money. So
right. Bill, thank you very much for spending this time with me. I had a wonderful time talking to you.
no problem.